1.4 billion people, 28 states, 22 officially recognized languages, and thousands more spoken in villages that never make it onto a census form. For most of the outside world, India is treated as a single entity, one flag, one government, one enormous population lumped together under a single national identity. Scientists decided to test that assumption the only way that actually works, not through census data, not through language surveys, not through cultural anthropology, but through the DNA itself. They collected genetic samples from 10 distinct regions spanning the length and breadth of the country, from the mountain passes of Kashmir in the far north to the tropical coastline of Kerala in the deep south, from the deserts of Rajasthan in the west to the dense jungles of India's northeastern frontier. They expected to find variation. Every population geneticist expects some regional differences within a country this large. What they did not expect was the scale of what the data revealed. Because when the results finally came back, they showed something that would force scientists to reconsider a question most people never think to ask. Is India actually one genetic population at all? Or is it, underneath the surface, something closer to a continent pretending to be a country? This is the story of what 10 regions of Indian DNA actually revealed. To understand why this question even matters, you have to understand something about India's geography that most outsiders never fully appreciate. This is not a small nation. India spans roughly 3,200 kilometers from its northernmost point to its southernmost tip, a distance comparable to crossing the continental United States. Along that distance sit deserts, snow-capped mountain ranges, tropical rainforests, river deltas, and coastlines bordering 2 different oceans. For tens of thousands of years, different waves of ancient humans moved into this land through different corridors at different times, carrying different genetic histories with them, long before anyone conceived of a single unified Indian identity. Compare that scale to Europe, a continent that most people instinctively understand contains dozens of genetically and culturally distinct populations. French, German, Italian, Greek, Polish, and dozens more, each with its own language, its own history, and its own genetic signature shaped by thousands of years of separate migration. India covers a comparable geographic footprint, contains a comparable range of climates and terrains, and has been continuously inhabited for a comparable, if not longer, stretch of human history. Yet for most of the world, and often within India's own national narrative as well, this entire landmass has been treated as though it produced a single, relatively uniform genetic population. The 10-region study set out to test whether that assumption could survive contact with the actual data. The genetic story scientists eventually pieced together begins with a foundational discovery made back in 2009 when geneticist David Reich and his colleagues analyzed DNA from dozens of ethnic groups across the subcontinent and identified 2 deep ancestral populations underlying nearly the entire modern Indian gene pool. The first, called Ancestral North Indian, or ANI, carries genetic ties stretching toward the Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe. The second, called Ancestral South Indian, or ASI, is a far older lineage native to the subcontinent itself, with no close genetic relatives found anywhere else on Earth. Nearly every person living in India today carries some blend of these 2 ancient populations, but, as researchers would soon discover, that blend looks dramatically different depending on exactly where in the country you're standing. Start in the north, in Punjab, and you find populations sitting at one extreme end of that ancestral spectrum. Communities here, Punjabi Sikh Jats, Muslim Kashmiris, and neighboring groups, carry some of the highest concentrations of ancestral North Indian ancestry found anywhere in the country, genetically linked to migrations that swept down through Central Asia and the Iranian plateau thousands of years ago, tied to the same Bronze Age movements that shaped populations across the border into Pakistan as well. Travel southwest into Rajasthan, and the genetic picture becomes noticeably more complex. Rajasthan sits at a natural crossroads, bordered by Pakistan to the west, and connected by ancient trade and migration routes to nearly every other region of India. Researchers studying the genetic relatedness of Rajasthani populations found connections stretching in every direction. Genetic affinities with Brahmin populations in Maharashtra and Haryana to the east and south, with Jharkhand and Bengal communities further still, and clear evidence of continuous ancient trade route gene flow moving both east and west across the state for centuries. One detailed study of the Rajasthani Brahmin population found the Y chromosome haplogroup R1a present in nearly 57% of the men tested, one of the highest concentrations of this particular ancient lineage documented anywhere in India, tracing back to Bronze Age, steppe migrations that moved through Central Asia long before Sanskrit was ever written down. Move east into Kashmir, nestled in the Himalayan foothills, and researchers found something that surprised even geneticists familiar with the region. Despite sitting geographically close to Punjab, And despite centuries of trade, marriage, and cultural exchange with neighboring valleys, certain Kashmiri populations show genetic patterns distinct enough that some studies place them in entirely different clusters than populations from Uttar Pradesh or Uttarakhand, states that sit right next door. Mountain geography, it turns out, can act as a genetic barrier every bit as powerful as an ocean or a desert, isolating valley communities from their neighbors for generation after generation, even when trade caravans cross those same mountain passes every single season. Head south into the state of Kerala, and the genetic story shifts again, this time dramatically. Kerala sits at the far end of the ANI-ASI spectrum, carrying some of the highest concentrations of ancestral South Indian ancestry anywhere in the country, alongside Dravidian-speaking tribal populations scattered throughout the southern hill regions. Researchers studying the genetic affinities of southwest coastal populations in Kerala found something particularly fascinating. Certain warrior and feudal lord communities along the coast carry additional genetic signatures linking them to ancient migrations from northwestern India, layered with detectable Middle Eastern genetic components. A signature researchers believe traces back to historical maritime trade routes that connected Kerala's Spice Coast to Arabia and the Persian Gulf for well over 1,000 years, long before European colonial trading companies ever arrived in the region. Cross over into Tamil Nadu, and researchers find some of the strongest concentrations of ancestral South Indian ancestry documented anywhere on the subcontinent, particularly among Dravidian tribal populations in the state's interior hill regions. These communities, in many cases, carry genetic signatures that connect more closely to some of the oldest human lineages ever recovered in South Asia, a genetic thread that researchers now believe stretches back tens of thousands of years to some of the very first waves of modern humans who migrated out of Africa and along the southern coastal route into the Indian subcontinent long before agriculture, long before the Indus Valley civilization, long before anything resembling recorded history existed anywhere on Earth. Then there is Bengal, sitting at the eastern edge of the country along the Bay of Bengal, a region whose genetic story is inseparable from its unique position as a corridor between South Asia and Southeast Asia. Researchers studying populations along both sides of the modern India-Bangladesh border found deep, ancient continuity linking Bengali communities across what is now an international boundary, alongside detectable genetic contributions from Tibeto-Burman and Austroasiatic populations who moved into the region from the east over thousands of years. Bengal, in other words, is not simply a genetic extension of the rest of northern India. It carries its own distinct layer of ancestry, shaped by migration corridors that most of the rest of the country never experienced at all. Move west, along India's Arabian Sea coastline, into Gujarat and Maharashtra. And yet another distinct genetic thread emerges, one shaped less by land migration and more by centuries of maritime contact. This stretch of coast has served as a trading gateway for thousands of years, linking the subcontinent to East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Persia long before European ships ever reached Indian shores. Genetic studies of communities along this coast, including populations descended from historical Persian, Zoroastrian refugees, East African city communities brought to the region through centuries of maritime trade, and Jewish communities who settled along the Konkan coast generations ago, reveal a genetic layering found almost nowhere else in the country, a base of long-established South Asian ancestry overlaid with distinct, well-documented genetic contributions from populations thousands of kilometers across the Arabian Sea. Unlike the ancient prehistoric admixture events that shape most of the rest of India's ancestry, some of these coastal genetic signatures reflect migrations that took place within the last few hundred to 2,000 years, recent enough in genetic terms that researchers can trace them with remarkable precision back to specific historical trade routes and documented migration events. Push further east into India's northeastern states, Assam, Manipur, Nagaland, Meghalaya, and the string of smaller states tucked between Bangladesh, Bhutan, Tibet, and Myanmar, and the genetic picture changes so dramatically that researchers studying HLA markers in the region found the local population carrying barely half the genetic diversity found among comparable sample sizes in northern India. This is not a flaw in the data. It reflects a genuinely distinct ancestral history. Populations across India's northeast carry substantial Tibeto-Burman ancestry, linked to migrations that moved south from the Tibetan Plateau and southern China over thousands of years, a genetic lineage almost entirely separate from the ANI-ASI framework that defines the rest of the subcontinent. In fact, researchers studying Tibeto-Burman populations straddling the India-Bangladesh border found these communities cluster more closely with East and Southeast Asian populations than with mainland Indian populations, just a few hundred kilometers to their west, meaning a person from India's northeastern frontier can, genetically speaking, share more ancestry with communities in Myanmar or southern China than with a fellow Indian citizen living in Delhi. Travel into the heart of the country, into Madhya Pradesh, a state so geographically and culturally central to India that it's often nicknamed the country's heartland, and researchers uncovered yet another distinct genetic layer entirely. Tribal populations here, including groups known as the Bharia, the Bil, and the Saharia, carry a mix of ancestries that reflects the region's unique position as a meeting point for three entirely separate language families: Indo-European, Dravidian, and Austroasiatic. Genetic analysis of these tribes revealed some of the oldest surviving maternal DNA lineages found anywhere in India, alongside Y chromosome markers specifically associated with ancient Austroasiatic-speaking populations, a genetic history connecting central Indian tribal communities to migration patterns that some researchers trace all the way back toward Southeast Asia, entirely separate from the Indo-Aryan and Dravidian genetic threads that dominate discussions of Indian ancestry. And then, tucked away in the Bay of Bengal, hundreds of kilometers from the Indian mainland, sit the Andaman Islands, home to one of the most genetically extraordinary populations found anywhere on the planet. Indigenous groups here, including the Onge and Jarawa communities, carry a genetic lineage so ancient and so isolated that researchers use it as a reference point for reconstructing what some of the very earliest human populations to reach South Asia may have looked like, genetically speaking, tens of thousands of years ago. Unlike almost every other population studied across mainland India, Andaman Islanders show no detectable trace of ancestral North Indian ancestry whatsoever. They represent, in the language of population genetics, an ASI-related population that never experienced the ANI admixture event that shaped the rest of the subcontinent. A living genetic snapshot of what South Asia's population may have looked like before that Bronze Age mixing ever took place at all. 10 regions, 10 strikingly different genetic stories. Punjab's Bronze Age steppe ancestry, Rajasthan's crossroads admixture, Kashmir's mountain-isolated lineages, Kerala's maritime trade signatures, Tamil Nadu's deep ASI roots stretching back tens of thousands of years, Bengal's south to southeast Asian corridor, Gujarat and Maharashtra's Arabian Sea trade route ancestry, the Northeast's Tibeto-Burman ancestry, closer genetically to Myanmar than to Delhi, Central India's Austroasiatic tribal lineages, and the Andaman Islands, carrying a genetic signature so ancient it predates the very mixing event that created the rest of the modern Indian population. Here is where the result that shocked researchers actually comes into focus, and it isn't simply that these 10 regions are different from one another. Every population geneticist studying a country this large expects regional variation. What genuinely surprised the scientific community was just how large some of these internal genetic distances turned out to be, once properly measured and compared side by side. In several documented cases, the genetic distance between two Indian populations living within the same country, say a Tibeto-Burman community in India's northeast, and a Dravidian tribal population in Tamil Nadu, is larger than the genetic distance measured between certain populations living in entirely different countries. A Naga community in India's northeast, in other words, can be genetically more distant from a Tamil family in southern India than that same Tamil family is from certain populations living across the border in Sri Lanka. India, treated by the rest of the world as a single genetic population, turns out to contain more internal genetic diversity than exists between many pairs of separate nations entirely. This finding forced researchers to formally expand their model of Indian ancestry. What began in 2009 as a relatively simple two-population framework, just ANI and ASI, has since grown into a model recognizing at least 5 distinct ancestral genetic components, contributing to the modern Indian population: ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian, ancestral Tibeto-Burman, ancestral Austroasiatic, and the deeply isolated Andamanese lineage that predates all the others. Later research has suggested the true picture may be even more layered than even that expanded model captures, particularly once ancient DNA recovered directly from archaeological sites, like the 5,000-year-old skeleton excavated from the Indus Valley site at Rakhigarhi in 2019, is factored into the analysis alongside modern population samples. The reason this genetic complexity has persisted for so long, remaining clearly visible even after thousands of years of shared history, trade, and cultural exchange, comes down to a single powerful social force that researchers keep returning to in study after study: endogamy. India is home to more than 4,000 distinct endogamous communities, groups that have, for religious, caste, or social reasons, overwhelmingly married within their own community for dozens, sometimes hundreds of generations. In many parts of the world, thousands of years of regional trade and cultural mixing would have gradually blended distinct ancestral genetic signals into a smoother, more homogeneous population. In India, the opposite happened. Strict, long-standing patterns of community-based marriage acted like a genetic time capsule, preserving ancient regional ancestry patterns with striking clarity, generation after generation, all the way into the present day. This is precisely why a study comparing 10 regions of Indian DNA can produce a result researchers describe as genuinely shocking. Not because India contains diversity, every geneticist studying a country of this size in history expects that, but because the sheer scale of that internal diversity rivals, and in some documented comparisons exceeds, the genetic differences found between entirely separate nations on other continents. The label Indian, when examined at the level of the genome, turns out to describe not one population, but a vast federation of ancient, distinct ancestral lineages, layered on top of one another by thousands of years of migration, isolation, mixing, and above all, ethnic separation, preserved carefully across generations by social custom rather than geography alone. The same endogamy pattern has produced another consequence that researchers have documented extensively, one with direct implications for modern medicine: unusually high rates of certain recessive genetic disorders concentrated within specific communities. Because many endogamous groups have maintained such tightly closed marriage networks for so many centuries, harmful recessive mutations that would normally remain rare and diluted across a larger, more genetically mixed population instead become concentrated within specific caste and community groups. Researchers studying this phenomenon have documented consanguinity rates, meaning marriages between close relatives, reaching as high as 20 to 30% in some Indian communities, a figure that dramatically increases the likelihood of rare inherited conditions surfacing generation after generation within those specific groups. This is precisely why India's genetic diversity isn't simply a matter of academic curiosity. It has direct, measurable consequences for public health policy, for genetic screening programs, and for how doctors across the country's 28 states approach inherited disease risk in populations that, genetically speaking, may have almost nothing in common with the community living just a few districts away. It's this exact concern that has driven India's government to invest heavily in one of the most ambitious genome sequencing efforts ever undertaken by a single nation. The Genome India Project, a nationwide initiative backed by the Indian government and coordinated across more than 20 research institutions, set out to sequence the genomes of tens of thousands of individuals drawn from across the country's most genetically and linguistically diverse populations. An effort explicitly designed to correct a long-standing gap in global genetic databases, which have historically been built overwhelmingly from European and East Asian samples, leaving South Asia's genetic diversity chronically underrepresented in medical research, despite representing nearly 1/5 of the entire world's population. Early findings from projects like this one have only reinforced what the 10-region comparison already suggested. India's population carries a staggering number of population-specific genetic variants that simply don't appear anywhere in the global reference databases doctors and researchers have relied on for decades. Variants that could hold the key to understanding disease risk, drug responses, and hereditary conditions for well over 1 billion people whose genetic profiles the rest of the world's medical research has largely overlooked until now. None of this diminishes the reality of a shared modern Indian national identity, built over centuries through common language administration, shared governance, and a genuinely unifying independence movement in the 20th century. Culture, citizenship, and identity are not disproven by a genetic map, any more than they were in the earlier documentary comparing India and Pakistan. What the data does show is that the story is far more layered than a simple single population narrative ever could capture, and that the true genetic history of this land was being written for tens of thousands of years, before anyone imagined a country stretching from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. Consider what this means in practical human terms. A software engineer in Bangalore, a rice farmer in West Bengal, a shepherd in the mountains of Kashmir, and a fisherman off the coast of Kerala may all carry Indian passports, sing the same national anthem, and vote in the same general elections, while carrying ancestral genetic threads that trace back to entirely different migration events, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, long before any of them, or their ancestors, ever heard the word India used to describe this land at all. Think about what that actually means, laid side by side. The Bangalore engineer may carry ancestral North Indian markers tracing back to Bronze Age migrations that swept down from Central Asia. The Bengal farmer may carry a distinct blend shaped by ancient contact with populations moving in from Southeast Asia. The Kashmiri shepherd's lineage may have been quietly isolated in the same mountain valley for thousands of years, protected from outside admixture by nothing more than altitude and geography. And the Kerala fisherman may carry genetic threads connecting his family, however distantly, to maritime traders who sailed across the Arabian Sea from the Persian Gulf, centuries before the first European ship ever rounded the Cape of Good Hope. 4 people, 1 nation. 4 almost entirely separate ancestral journeys, each one thousands of years in the making, each one converging quietly onto the same modern map. It also means that the northeastern states, often treated, even within India's own domestic media and politics, as a kind of genetic and cultural afterthought to the rest of the country, actually preserve one of the most scientifically important genetic lineages on the entire subcontinent. A direct link to the ancient human migrations that connected South Asia to East and Southeast Asia, a genetic bridge that mainland Indian populations largely do not share. It means the tribal communities of central India, frequently overlooked in mainstream national narratives built around dominant caste and regional groups, carry among the oldest and most scientifically valuable maternal DNA lineages found anywhere on the subcontinent, genetic threads that may stretch back tens of thousands of years, quietly preserved in some of the country's most marginalized and least studied communities. And it means the tiny, remote population of the Andaman Islands, numbering only in the low hundreds today and facing serious survival pressures from disease and outside contact, may represent one of the last living genetic windows into what South Asia's population looked like before the ancient mixing event that created the ancestry of over 1 billion people living across the mainland today. When researchers talk about the urgency of studying and protecting indigenous populations like the Andaman Islanders, this is precisely what they mean. An irreplaceable genetic archive, held in the DNA of a few hundred people, that no laboratory anywhere else on Earth can recreate once it's gone. Depth measured not in years or even centuries, but in tens of thousands of years of human migration, isolation, and survival, all converging onto the same modern map, inside the same modern borders, carried forward in the DNA of well over 1 billion people who call this land home today. There's one more pattern worth sitting with before this story closes: the relationship between India's genetic map and its linguistic map, because the two, it turns out, rarely line up as neatly as most people assume. India recognizes 4 major language families within its borders: Indo-European languages spoken across the north, Dravidian languages spoken across the south, Austroasiatic languages spoken by tribal communities scattered through central and eastern India, and Tibeto-Burman languages spoken across the northeast. It would be easy to assume that each language family corresponds to a single, clean genetic population, Indo-European speakers carrying one ancestry, Dravidian speakers carrying another, and so on. The genetic data tells a messier, more interesting story. Communities speaking Dravidian languages in the south carry varying proportions of both ANI and ASI ancestry, depending on caste and region, meaning 2 people who speak the same Dravidian language, live in the same state, and belong to the same broad linguistic family can carry meaningfully different ancestral genetic profiles, depending on which community they descend from.